Hello and welcome to Deer Hunting 101 with the Illinois Learn to Hunt program. Today's webinar is going to be kind of the first part of a three-part series to kind of get people ready and interested in deer hunting in Illinois this upcoming season. So this is kind of the first iteration of this series. So today we're going to focus a lot on regulations, on the history of hunting, as well as how to find land. So we're going to go over land access, as well as some basic deer behavior and deer ecology, which is critically important to hunters. And I think that's a lot of hunters really focus on gear, and I think paying a little bit more attention to understanding the nuances of animal behavior can really impact your success of field. So a few quick reminders before we get started today. Your microphones and webcams are disabled for this webinar just to kind of keep everything on track. If you do have any questions, there is a chat feature as well as a Q&A feature, so you can drop your comments or questions in the chat, and we'll try to answer those as they come through. And we should have a few minutes at the end for a quick Q&A if you have any additional questions on material maybe that we didn't cover, or even outside of the realm of deer hunting. We can certainly tackle some of those. So here's kind of a quick rundown of today's webinar. I thank you again for joining us live, and for those who are viewing the recording later on, if you have any questions, feel free to email us or send us a message on Facebook, Instagram, any of those platforms, and we're happy to help. So again, today's quick outline, a quick conversation about what hunting is, why hunting is still important as we kind of transition to a more modern society. Why is hunting still relevant? Then we'll do a deep dive into deer hunting regulations. What credentials do you need? What are the legal methods of take? So we'll kind of go over that entire process. And then, like I said, we'll dive right into the hunting aspects of things. So we'll do a quick conversation about land access, how to find land, what land can be hunted, and then we'll go over some deer behavior and kind of wrap up with some hunting tactics and setups, as well as scouting techniques. So my name is Dan Stevens. I'll be one of your presenters today, and the other is Curtis Twellman. Curtis, if you want to say hello.
Hello, everybody.
So we'll kind of be your presenters today, walking you through this information. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or in the Q&A feature. And just as another quick reminder, if you do happen to need to leave early, we are recording this webinar and it will be uploaded to YouTube here shortly. It usually takes about a few hours for it to process, and then it has to go through YouTube, and they process it and check for copyright and all that. But at the conclusion, we'll send out a link to the recording, so you can always go back and view it. So we'll kind of jump right in with kind of why hunting is still relevant. But one thing I want to talk about is just the total deer harvest in Illinois. A lot of people think it tends to fluctuate from year to year, and certainly there are some fluctuations, whether it's weather that can kind of impact things. If you have a disease outbreak like EHD, which is epizootic hemorrhagic disease, occasionally you have a year where it's prolific and bad. I wish this graphic went back a year prior, because it was in 2012 when we had the really last substantial EHD breakout. I believe the numbers, they recorded over almost 3,000 deer died that year of EHD. And again, those are just reported numbers. So those are just what people are out there seeing and finding, and then reporting those to IDNR. But with this, what I just really wanted to highlight is there's a lot of deer in Illinois. Illinois is, for many people, one of the hotbeds for deer hunting. So there's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of access, and there's a lot of deer available. And here it is, just kind of breaking down the numbers a little bit more. If you're ever curious, are most of those harvests from firearm hunters? Are they from archery hunters? Well, here's kind of a quick kind of illustration that kind of depicts these numbers. And what I find interesting is firearm is obviously about 50% of our harvest. So here you can see in 2019, it was about 49% exactly. Now, what's interesting is in Illinois, we have a very shortened firearm season, which we'll get into as we kind of progress through regulations. Where your archery hunters have a much longer season, and on average, it'll take your average deer hunter. They've done really significant surveys of deer hunters in Illinois. The average bow hunter hunts about 16 to 17 days a season, where the average firearm hunter may only hunt 2 or 3. So there's kind of that depiction there, and you kind of get to decide, do you want to steer towards the firearm, maybe towards the archery, or like me, both. Certainly an option. So why is hunting still relevant? Even as we've transitioned to a more modern society, we've kind of developed these quote unquote global food systems that obviously we're all experiencing significant shortages and inflation in recently. So hunting is a way to provide an extra source of protein for your family, and it's oftentimes very lean. It's very healthy. We all know that there's kind of this big kick on the organic food movement. Well, if you ask me, it doesn't really get much more organic than harvesting a deer or a pheasant or a goose or even a duck, and cooking that yourself. That's, in my opinion, about as organic as you can personally get. So hunting is kind of one of the foundations of how wildlife is managed in Illinois, in the United States, and even in North America. There's this concept called the North American model of wildlife conservation, and it's these kind of 7 pillars or 7 tenets that wildlife managers and state agencies and federal agencies use to drive wildlife management. And one of those tenets is hunting is a right for all. And so hunting is kind of ingrained in the way that wildlife managers manage these populations. It allows us to reduce overabundant populations. In doing so, we can control disease risk. We can control human and wildlife conflicts, because that's a big concern, especially for deer. In some of these more urban areas, you can see it. If you go to Cook County Forest Preserves, or even where we are in Champaign County, you have some of these local county parks that are just completely overrun with deer. And in many cases, you can walk through those forests and you'll see all the vegetation from about 5 feet and below is just completely gone. And that's, again, because these deer are just overabundant in that area. They're overbrowsing everything. And eventually that's going to lead to detrimental effects, whether it's starvation, whether it's disease risk, because they're just coming into contact with more and more animals. They're not social distancing. So all these things are really important. And that's why hunting is a very valid wildlife management tool. Now, obviously in Illinois, we've seen some pretty distinct changes across the landscape, and that really does impact how wildlife can use and can utilize the land. And I just like to quickly throw up this graphic to show how different it is from just a couple hundred years ago. Illinois was really this natural mosaic of wetlands and prairies and forest, where now it's oftentimes dominated by urban development and agriculture. But there are some species that really seem to thrive in this new kind of agriculture and urban dominated landscape. And to some extent, deer really do seem to thrive in this landscape. And so there is quite a substantial opportunity. And if you look back in Illinois in the early to mid 1950s, it was very, very, very unusual to ever see a deer. There were one of the first deer seasons in Illinois was in the mid 50s. And I remember I read a newspaper article, and there was a hunter who was just walking through the woods, and he came across a set of tracks. And that made his whole season, just seeing where a deer walked. And now we go out to a park and you may see 15, 20 deer all in one evening. So it's really this interesting dichotomy between what the habitat used to look like, but also what it looks like now, and how some of these species can certainly thrive even in this kind of patchwork habitat that we see today. Now, I should kind of continue along this conversation. There's been a substantial decline of hunters since about the mid 1970s. And so this is an important aspect of hunting, is getting more hunters involved, getting more hunters out there, not only to manage wildlife populations, but also to provide food sources, to get outdoor recreation, to spend times with friends and family. So we all certainly thank you all for joining us today and for taking this next step to either becoming a hunter or becoming a more educated hunter. Hunters also fund conservation. So there's this federal legislation that was passed in 1937 called the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Act. And essentially it's an excise tax that's placed on firearms, ammunition, archery equipment. That money is then allocated, which is really cool, to the U.S. Secretary of Interior, not to the U.S. Department of Treasury. So that money can't be gobbled up and used for infrastructure projects, for all these other initiatives that the federal government does. This money goes to the Secretary of Interior, and then that money is divided amongst the states to be used for very specific use cases that focus on public lands, on wildlife, and on wildlife habitat. So hunters directly fund conservation through purchasing equipment as well as licenses and permits. Now, a few language and kind of lingo you'll hear us use throughout this presentation today, just to kind of make sure we're all on the same baseline, so to speak. Buck is going to be a male deer. You can see a couple pictures here in the bottom left. The male does have antlers. There are very, very rare instances where you may have a female that develops antlers, but 99.999% of the time that's going to be a male. A doe is a female. They carry antlers. You may hear some people call them horns. That's kind of a colloquial term that a lot of hunters use, but technically, if you're going by, by the book, that is incorrect. Horns do not shed annually. They continue to grow each year and each year, where antlers shed each year and then they regrow them, which is really cool because it's essentially one of the fastest growing structures in the animal kingdom is deer antlers. The ability to, I mean, you can see the size of these antlers. They can grow those in just a few months. It's pretty incredible. A few vocalizations. Grunt is kind of a low pitch vocalization that kind of sounds like this gurgle, kind of a a snort is kind of a loud vocalization or an alarm call. A button buck is a deer that is a buck that is typically about 6 to 9 months old, so they're still in kind of that fawn stage and they haven't really developed their antlers yet. You can kind of see it here in the top right picture, those little buttons. A brow tine is going to be this tine right here that kind of shoots right off of the base of that antler. Some people call them an eye guard or different things, but that is known as the brow tine. And one other term I want to highlight is the difference between a typical rack and a non-typical rack. So on the left here, we have a typical rack, which means all those points and all those antlers and beams and tines kind of go off in a direction that you expect. It's a typical, where in a non-typical, like this big buck here in the middle, he's got points that are coming down, he's got points that are forking, he's got these unique splits. That would be classified as a non-typical. So now that we got kind of through that, we're going to jump right into regs. And I know this is kind of a fairly boring section. I'll try to make it as interesting as I possibly can, but I want to provide the information as best as we can. So what regs do we need to know? We need to know when we can hunt. So what are those hunting seasons? What are those shooting hours? What are the possession limits? And what I find really important is what are the licenses and permits? Because every state is a little bit different. I grew up hunting Missouri and Kentucky and Arkansas, and coming to Illinois, it was a completely different system. And so understanding what exactly you need to have to make sure you're legal is important. And we'll also talk about some restrictions about equipment, clothing, and also post-harvest procedures. So we'll kind of jump right into this. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A feature, and Curtis will bring it to my attention and we'll get through it. So the easiest way to find the hunting regulations are to use the Illinois Digest of Hunting and Trapping Regulations. You can find it online. You can find it at sporting goods stores. Typically, it takes a while to get to sporting goods stores, I'll admit. DNR has tried to expedite that, it seems. So hopefully this year stores are starting to get them a little bit earlier than they did last year. I think either last year or the year before, it was almost mid-October before they started getting those shipped. But you can find it online. It's already available now. But I should reiterate, this is not the Wildlife Code. So this is not a legally binding document. This is a document that DNR puts together as basically a summary of the regulation. So if you maybe, for instance, you think you found a loophole to allow you to use a certain firearm or something to that extent, make sure you're reading through the actual Wildlife Code that has the actual language used legally, where this is kind of DNR's interpretation of those to try to make it a little easier for people to read and digest. So now we're going to talk a little bit about credentials, right? So obviously, most people are going to be required to take a hunter safety course. If you were born on or after January 1st, 1980, you are required to have it. If you were born before that, you are technically grandfathered in. There's a few different types of classes, and the nice thing is this is a once in a lifetime thing. Once you take it, you're done. You don't ever have to recertify. In most states in the country will actually accept other hunter safeties. So it's not like, maybe you want to go hunt Missouri. You don't have to take their hunter safety. They will accept Illinois. And so it's really a kind of a one-time thing. There are a few different course types. If you're under 18 years of age or older, you are you will have to do an instructor-led course. There is kind of now a hybrid option where they can do a portion of it online, but still have to do a field day component. But if you're over 18 years, you can do the entire course online. That does cost about $25 or $30, I can't quite remember, where the instructor-led courses are free. And that's only because there's a third-party service who created the online curriculum and who houses that entire program. And so it does cost a little bit, but it's nice because it saves your progress, so you don't have to jump back and forth and things like that. Another important credential, obviously this is only if you're hunting with a firearm. So if you're planning on only bow hunting, no issues, you do not need to have this. But since we do live in the state of Illinois, you are required to have a firearm owner's identification card or a FOID card. So regardless of who owns the firearm, any Illinois resident who has a firearm or ammunition in their possession needs to have a valid FOID card. I do want to reiterate, these are issued by the Illinois State Police, not by the Illinois DNR. I know we communicate with Illinois DNR quite frequently, and they get a lot of questions about FOID cards, and unfortunately they cannot legally answer those. They'll immediately direct you to the state police. So if you have any questions about that's who to reach out to. But you can complete the entire application process online. It's about $10, and it does expire after 10 years, so you'll have to renew it. Now I will say, when COVID first hit, there was, gosh, the longest delay. I know I moved during the pandemic and was trying to get my address changed, and I think it took 9 months before I finally got mine back. I've heard they've expedited it and have either increased staffing capacity or increased their just capacity to run it. So it sounds like there is a less of a lag, but I still recommend if you're interested in firearm hunting or owning a firearm, try to get that in earlier rather than later, because oftentimes it does take a little bit before you'll get that FOID card back. So quickly run over statewide hunting season. So when can you hunt deer in Illinois? Well, again, it kind of depends on the method of take that you choose. If you're going to bow hunt, you'll have one season. If you want to gun hunt with a shotgun, you'll have a separate season. Now, my recommendation is bow hunt. Obviously, that's not for everybody, but the big challenge here is if you just look at the season dates for firearm, for instance, 18 to 20th of November. You have 3 days for the first season and you have 4 days for the second season. So you may only have 7 days out of the entire year to deer hunt. And that's if you're lucky, if you draw a permit. Where with archery, you have in essence 3.5 months. There's a few gaps in there where it closes down for the statewide shotgun and firearm seasons, but you're getting a lot more opportunity and you're getting a lot more access as well, because again, as we kind of move through this regulation section, you'll notice a lot of the firearm permits are by lottery applications. And me personally, I've put in applications for several years in a row and haven't drawn anything, and then I'll have a few years where I draw it every single year. And so it's really hit or miss, but having that backup of being able to archery hunt is a great option. And even if you don't feel comfortable drawing back a normal vertical bow, you can now use crossbows legally throughout the entirety of the archery season. Historically, it was only eligible for people over a certain age or with medical disabilities that could use a crossbow. But a few years ago, DNR has now switched that to where anybody can use a crossbow during the statewide archery season. And it's actually pretty interesting. I was reading through the Hunter Harvest Report that's conducted annually, where they do a big survey of a bunch of hunters and ask them a bunch of questions. And we are starting to see a drastic shift where crossbows are starting to overtake vertical bows. The first couple years that crossbows were legal for everybody, it was about 30% of hunters were using crossbows, where now it's just about 50% of archery hunters are using crossbows as opposed to vertical bows. So it's becoming very popular. It's easier to use, it's easier to practice with, and especially if you're not, a big framed individual or you're, maybe not as strong, crossbows are certainly a great option. And I should also note the shooting hours. For deer hunting, it is 30 minutes before the official sunrise and 30 minutes after the official sunset. So it's not at sunrise and not at sunset, but you have 30 minutes on either side of those windows. And as we get through the ecology section a little bit, that's when deer are fairly active, during those kind of crepuscular or twilight hours. And so just kind of keep that in mind, 30 minutes before sunrise to 30 minutes after sunset. So if you're
And we
interested
do
in
have
getting
one question in the chat
bet.
about antler shed hunting.
Sure.
Are there any restrictions on antler shed hunting on public or private ground?
That's a great question, and I wish there was an easy way to answer it. Unfortunately, the way that I will say Illinois is not unique in this. A lot of it depends on the classification of the piece of public land that you're interested in shed hunting. So if you're looking at maybe a state park, so you know DNR has several state parks that allow hunting that you can hunt during the normal hunting season. A lot, maybe even all of those restrict you to not pick up sheds to where you cannot legally shed hunt at those state parks. The vast majority of state fish and wildlife areas of federal properties like the Shawnee National Forest, you can have pretty good success. And I'll tell you what I have found very successful is if you can get access to private land. And we'll kind of talk about this a little bit in the land access section, but deer hunting permissions difficult to obtain when you're reaching out to private landowners, but asking about shed hunting and starting to build that relationship with a farmer or with a landowner can really increase your odds at maybe being able to actually deer hunt it later. So definitely just make sure you're checking the classification of the piece of public ground you're checking. And also county parks. County parks oftentimes do not allow shed hunting and have regulations in place that restrict it. I know Cook County is very big on that, as well as Will County, and some of the, I think even Kane County Forest Preserves does not allow shed hunting. So a lot of it just depends on the individual site. All right, so lottery permits, and I just saw we had a question about archery hunting and firearm permits, and we're actually going to get to that in the next few slides, so we'll answer that just in a second. But lottery permits, in Illinois, again, we have a low amount of public land available. If you look at the totality of the state, it's less than 2% of Illinois is publicly owned, where in other states it's much more substantial. If you look at states like Pennsylvania, you know, they're up to about 35-40% is public land. And so we don't have a lot of public land in the state. And so they have to kind of restrict it somehow so you know the public land just doesn't get overwhelmed with hunters, where in some states like Missouri, a lot of sites you can just go to Bass Pro, buy an over-the-counter firearm tag, and just go hunt. In Illinois, to hunt on public land, even county land too, which we'll get into, you'll need to apply for this permit. And so we're going to focus on firearm for now. There's essentially two permit types for firearm. There's a county level tag and there's a site-specific permit issued by DNR. So a county tag can be used on private land in that specific county that you have a tag for or a permit for, where the site specific is literally only for that specific site. So let's say you drew a permit for Middle Fork State Fish and Wildlife Area. You would only be able to hunt Middle Fork State Fish and Wildlife Area with that site specific firearm tag. If you were to get a county level tag, let's say in the same county that Middle Fork is, which is Vermilion County, so you have a Vermilion County firearm tag, you don't have a Middle Fork, just a Vermilion, you cannot legally hunt Middle Fork with that firearm tag, but you can hunt any private ground in that county. Oftentimes there's some county parks that may have a deer hunting program. Federal property can be hunted on a county level tag. And so a lot of it depends on what type of ground you're interested in hunting. Now, unfortunately, the application periods for this year have pretty much all closed. But what I will say is if you're interested in firearm hunting and you're kind of out of options, your first option is going to be trying to get private land access, which we'll talk about in the land access section. We'll give you some tips and tricks to make that process a little easier, or the Shawnee National Forest. The Shawnee National Forest, again, is federal property. You do not have to have a site-specific permit drawn by a lottery, but you do have to have a county permit. Now, county permits, oftentimes there's a surplus. They don't always get allocated through this lottery, and so they become what they call over-the-counter. And so you can purchase these remaining county-level firearm tags over-the-counter after the lotteries have closed. So that hasn't happened yet. The OTC tags the firearm tags over the counter will go for sale here in the next few weeks. So you still have a little bit of time to research. And Illinois DNR does do a nice job. If you go to their deer hunting page, it oftentimes can be hard to find, and we'll send this link in the follow-up email after this webinar, but they have a link that they put up that shows how many tags are left after each lottery. So after the first, after the second, and after the third. And so you can start to see which counties still have a surplus of tags, and you might be able to focus your efforts that way. Now, switching to archery a little bit, archery does not have to have lottery in many cases. There are some very specific use cases where an individual site may be very small. Particularly up in the Chicagoland area, you may have a property that only allows 10 hunters on it. They may have a very specific site lottery, but in the totality, archery tags are over the counter. They're not site specific. So I can buy an archery tag and I can go hunt Weldon Springs, which is about an hour west. I can go hunt Middle Fork, which is about an hour east. I can go hunt Kickapoo. I can go hunt Clinton Lake. So I can hunt all these different sites with that one individual permit. And again, that's because we don't have this, congregation of hunters all trying to hunt on 3 or 4 days like you do in the firearm season. It helps to spread things out, and that's that's why I'm such a big proponent of archery. Is not only do you have that longer season, but you also have increased access, because a lot of these public lands, you can just go and buy your credentials, get your deer tags, your archery over-the-counter tags, not through a lottery, and just go hunt.
And you kind of answered this, Dan, but we did have a question about how realistic it is to get a firearms permit during the OTC. So do you know some of the areas where it might be highly probable and some of the areas where it's highly not probable?
Yeah, a lot of it depends on the individual county. And again, I would definitely check those lottery results on their website that shows how many are remaining in each county. I have never had an issue trying to at least get one of the counties in the Shawnee National Forest. Typically, one or two of them may only have, a few permits remaining, but typically there's at least one county that has an abundance. Now, I do recommend, and I'll kind of have Curtis check on this while I'm kind of going through this, but try to be there right when the OTC option goes for sale, because everybody's trying to get those last remaining. So if you can be there the day of, you're going to increase your chances of certainly obtaining one. And now, again, obviously, we are the Illinois Learn to Hunt program. We focus on Illinois. There are a lot of other Midwestern states that have great hunting opportunities that can be affordable for non-residents. Now, you will have to pay more as a non-resident. Typically, it's substantially more. Like in Missouri, it may be $250 for a firearm deer tag, but you may just be able to go buy a firearm tag over the counter and go hunt at public land. So that is certainly another option as well. But again, that's why I'm such a big proponent of archery, and especially if you've never shot a bow before, crossbows are a great option to get started, because you can really buy those tags over the counter and have lots of access in many cases. So there's a new IDNR website. I don't know, most people have probably seen it by now if you've bought licenses in the past, whether it's a hunting, fishing, trapping, or even camping reservations are now through this new website. Excuse me. This will be your new website to basically secure all these necessary credentials. And if you go through the lottery application, which again has already closed for this year, but I'll give you a nice way to remember it for next year. During the spring, that's when you're going to submit your firearm application for deer. During deer season is when you submit your spring turkey. So that's kind of how I try to remember it in my head. Spring turkey, I submit my deer application. During deer season, I'm submitting my spring turkey application, because it's kind of the same process of lotteries and getting a permit that way. But the nice thing about lottery applications is you can create a group. So maybe you want to go in with 2 or 3 of your buddies or your family members, and you kind of want to have it to where, oh, I don't want just one of our buddies to draw and then the other 2 don't. You can make it so you either all draw or you don't. And now this does not change your lottery odds at all. The way the formula reads through them, it doesn't impact your lottery odds one way or the other. So it doesn't increase or decrease the likelihood of getting a permit. But the nice thing is, if one of you draws, you're all going to draw. And so you do have that option to still kind of simulate that hunt camp that so many people like. So just kind of in summary.
Just real quick, I did look on the DNR webpage. It's October 18th. So 10/18/2022, so a little over a month away is when the OTC sales will start. So mark it on the calendar, set a reminder on your phone or Facebook or something.
Yep.
That's the day. Get in
And
line, get them while they're hot. It's
you
like
bet.
Black
And again,
Friday,
that's just for these firearm deer over-the-counter
OTC.
permits. There will be no site-specific left. Those are all allocated through the lottery, so these will only be those county-level tags. Now, I will say, excuse me, in some instances, there are a few properties that DNR owns that can be hunted on a county-level tag. And the easiest way to find that information is if you open up the Hunting and Trapping Digest and go all the way to the back pages. It's pages that most people don't ever look at because it's just these really complex tables and figures going everywhere. But what it does is it lists every single DNR site in the state and shows what permit is needed. There are a very few that will allow you to hunt that DNR property with a county level tag. And so you may be able to look at those remaining permits when that list gets publicized here in the next 2 weeks or so and see if there are any of those counties any of those county tags left, and you may be able to swing another public land hunt that way. But just kind of to summarize what credentials you need. So we need hunter safety. Again, if you're born on or after January 1st, 1980, you will need a FOID card. If you're firearm hunting, if you're archery hunting, you do not need a FOID card. You'll need a base hunting license. And there are several types of base hunting licenses depending on your age or your veteran status. Some people will buy a lifetime hunting license, so they only have to buy it once and they never have to think about it again. But typically your kind of annual hunting license is what most people get. And so that's just that base hunting license. You will also need an electronic habitat stamp, which you can see here in kind of this top column is your state habitat stamp. That's only $5. The nice thing about the state habitat stamp is that money is allocated very, very, very specifically, and it can only be used to build and manage new habitat on public lands. And so it's got these very specific use cases. So again, kind of how we started this conversation, it's hunters are funding conservation through license sales. So you'll need that base hunting license, the electronic habitat stamp, and then your applicable deer permit, whether it's going to be an archery permit or a firearm. Now, what I recommend, especially with if you're going to bow hunt or get into archery, is to get a combination permit. And so you can see that here under deer archery permits, you have this combination archery permit. The nice thing about this, it's $25, where if you just buy a single tag, it's going to be $15. Now, what I like about getting the combination is it gives me one either sex, so I can harvest either a buck or a doe with that tag, and it also gives me one antlerless permit. And so that's an important distinction about permits, is it's not by gender of the animal. It's not whether it's a male or a female. It's whether it possesses antlers or whether it does not possess antlers. Because if we go back to our first couple slides about deer hunting language, there was that button buck that just had these two little nubs that are darn near impossible for the vast majority of hunters to see, especially when a deer is at 30 yards and it's just after sunrise or just before sunrise. It's still quite dark. So you don't need to know whether it's technically a male or a female. It's just whether it possesses those antlers or whether it does not possess those antlers. Now, there are some instances where you might need additional site-specific credentials. Those will be listed in the Illinois DNR Hunter fact sheets, which we'll talk about here in a second, but they basically tell you exactly what you can do and where you can do it at a specific property. But these site-specific credentials are normally free. One common one is the Illinois DNR windshield card, which is just a windshield card you print off, throw in your windshield as you park to go hunting. That just lets any conservation officer or any site staff know that, yep, there's a hunter here, that's what he's doing, they're good to go, and they just kind of carry on. So those quickly come, and they don't always look at them, it's just that's another credential that you may be required to have, where some of these sites may have a check-in and check-out procedure where you have to go into a physical location, quickly sign your name, then go hunt, and then upon completing your hunt, come back and sign out to let them know that you came and you went. And so those will all be in those DNR Hunter fact sheets that we'll talk about here in a second. So a little bit more about legal method of take. I know I've kind of talked touched on this a little bit, so we'll kind of move through it rather quickly, but depending on what you want to hunt with, how you want to hunt, when you want to hunt, there's a couple different options. Again, I'm a big proponent of archery just because of the totality of hunting access as well as opportunity, but there's certainly opportunities for shotgun, for muzzleloader, as well as center fire handguns. There are some very specific archery related regulations. I'm not going to read through these, so don't worry. I know it looks boring and tiresome. The vast majority of bows that you would go purchase at a store will meet these credentials. And these are also in the digest, so you can always refer back to them if you're going out to purchase a new bow. You can quickly look at this and make sure. But typically the big one that I would at least kind of pay attention to is the diameter of your broadhead. And so that's the cutting end of your arrow. Remember, we're not using field tip that's just kind of like a pencil. That's for practice. We're using a broadhead that's got cutting blades. You want to make sure that it meets that minimum diameter when it's fully open to make sure it has good penetrating power as well as good cutting surface, so you make sure you get that quick, humane, ethical harvest. A few firearm and muzzleloader regulations. Shotguns are the primary firearm that the vast majority of hunters are going to use in Illinois. We will talk about some new legislation that was just recently passed here in the next slide, but for now we're going to focus on shotguns. And so for this season, that's kind of what you're looking at. For firearm, it's going to be shotgun, a muzzleloader, which is a single fire rifle, which is loaded from the muzzle, kind of like your old ball and musket from the Civil War. It kind of revolves around that same technology, so those can also be used. Now, what I will say with shotguns, pay attention to the gauge. That's really the important thing. And remember that we're not using, shotgun BB pellets like you would if you're out duck hunting or goose hunting or pheasant hunting. We're not using buckshot. We're using a single projectile slug that's inside of that shotgun shell. So it still performs similar to a rifle in that it's a single projectile that has a distance about 100, 150 yards you can be quite accurate with. But make sure you're within a 10 gauge or a 20 gauge. So there are 28 gauges. There is a 410, which not a gauge, it's a caliber, but that's a very small shotgun. Those cannot legally be used for deer hunting. They just don't have enough energy and don't have enough power to get that humane harvest. So most people are going to be using a 12, a 16, or a 20 gauge. Those are fairly common on the marketplace. You can find ammunition for those quite readily in normal years. It's hard to tell what things are going to look like again this year. But if you're interested, definitely look into that a little bit more. And if you are interested in firearm hunting, I do recommend probably starting to think about this process soon, even though we still have a few months away before that mid-November-ish season, because there are shortages. It can be difficult to find ammunitions. I was in the store the other day trying to buy a new muzzleloader for my wife, and we're on a waiting list because it's just taking, the supply chains are just not catching up. So I would look into it sooner rather than later if you're making a new purchase. Now, again, I mentioned there was some new legislation passed this year. We get to use rifles in Illinois now. That's kind of been a big push for many people. There's a lot of people kind of on the fence whether they like the rifle hunting or they want to stick with the shotgun. I will say there are some very specific nuances of this legislation that further restrict the specific rifle you can use. It's got to be a single shot, it's got to be center fire, and it's got to be 30 caliber. And there's even a few other regulations, but I do want to mention this is not legal this year. This will not go into effect until January 1st, 2023, which means we're talking about next November's deer season is when you'll be able to use a rifle. And we plan on having a bunch of different webinars and discussions and videos really diving into these to show what specific calibers can be used, what rifles have good ballistics within these restrictions. So kind of keep on the lookout for those if you're interested in rifle hunting. Again, not this year, but next year. I did mention some of these site-specific regulations, so this is where you can find those. This is the Illinois DNR Hunter Fact Sheets. These are a really nice document because it puts everything in layman's terms. It tells you exactly what you can do, where you can do it, when you can do it, and how you can do it. Usually after reading through the Hunter Fact Sheet for a specific Illinois DNR site, you normally shouldn't have too many questions about what you can legally hunt or where at that site. They are pretty good about spelling that out. I will say the maps are oftentimes bad. Sometimes you may find a site that a map is hand drawn from like the 60s or 70s, and it's very frustrating. But DNR did launch a new hunting website called huntillinois.org. Curtis will drop a quick link to that in the chat. But they have a new tool on there called Hunt Map, and it's essentially an ArcGIS style software that basically shows all the property boundaries. It's interactive, it shows the satellite imagery, and it often even shows the zones. And so let's say you're out dove hunting. With dove hunting, you may be assigned to a very specific field. It shows those fields on this hunt map. So it's not hand drawn. You can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can print them. So definitely play around with that tool if you haven't yet. It's oftentimes a lot better than these hunter fact sheet maps. I know it's still a new tool that's in development, so there may be still some boundary issues. So if you're really close to a property boundary, I would definitely recommend looking at the hunter fact sheet map just to double check, or even call the site staff. Again, I don't think enough hunters take spend the not spend the time, but take the time to contact the site staff. If you have a question, that's their job. Their job is to answer your questions. There's a site superintendent, their number's public. Give them a call if you have a very specific question. They'll be happy to answer those questions for you. They know that property literally better than anybody. And even as a new hunter, or maybe you're just starting at that site, you can oftentimes, hey, I'm brand new to this site. Could you at least kind of point me in the right direction of where a lot of hunters go? Because I want to try to avoid hunters, or little things like that. So don't be afraid to reach out and call us at Learn to Hunt, or call the site staff. They can be very helpful. Some clothing requirements: blaze orange, or recently they passed legislation allowing blaze pink to be worn. That is only required for firearm hunting. So whether you're in the late CWD firearm season, whether you're in the normal firearm season, whether you're in the youth firearm season, if you're firearm hunting or you're out there during firearm season, you have to have blaze orange or blaze pink. What I do want to really highlight is, if you go to a sporting goods stores, don't always assume what they have on the shelf is legal to use. You'll see a lot of stores that'll sell bait, that'll sell supplements that you can go and dump out to attract deer. We cannot bait in Illinois. We cannot feed deer in Illinois. That is illegal. Another common thing to see, and why I'm bringing this up, is you can see this camouflage blaze orange here on the right. That is not legal in Illinois. It's got to be what we consider unbroken blaze orange. So even my hat, even though it's got this safety blaze orange, this technically would not be legal to hunt with. You need to have a solid blaze orange hat and a solid upper garment that's blaze orange, and that's got to have 400 square inches of total surface. What most hunters do, what I personally do during firearm season, I don't go out and buy a brand new coat that's just blaze orange. What I do is I get a cheap vest that you can usually find for 5, 10, 15, however much you really want to spend, at a sporting goods store, and you just throw that right over your normal camo, and then you're good to go. But what I do want to highlight is there's this youth archery season, or youth firearm season, and I'll quickly go back to the season dates just to show it. So October 8th through the 10th, there will be youth out there with firearms. So if you're out there bow hunting, you are legally required to wear your blaze orange vest and cap that equal 400 square inches. And again, it's for safety, complete safety. The blaze orange works, blaze pink works. You can see it from a long distance away. So just make sure, even if you're not firearm hunting, if there's a firearm season going on, you need to have that blaze orange on, and you need to have it on the entirety of while you hunt. Some states are a little bit different. Some states that camo orange is legal. That's kind of common out west, more so than in the Midwest. Some states will allow you to take off the blaze orange once you begin hunting, and then you only have to wear it while you're kind of moving. In Illinois, you need to have it on the entire time you're afield. So the second you leave the parking lot, it needs to be on, and don't take it off until you are back in the parking lot, essentially. For archery, you don't need it. Typically, I like to at least I'll wear a hat similar to this that's got a little blaze orange. And that's not necessarily for safety, but more so just to let other hunters know. So if they're walking, I see somebody else kind of walking to where I'm set up, I can just quickly take off my hat, wave it, and they can kind of see, oh, somebody's already there, and they'll just kind of meander and go their own separate way. So it's kind of a communication tool, but it certainly is nice to at least have a little bit of blaze orange while you're kind of moving around during archery season, but it's not required. So legal game, we talked a little bit about this during the permit section. Legal game is dependent on which permit you have. And it's important to remember, we're not talking about the gender of the animal. We're talking about whether it possesses antlers or whether it does not possess antlers. So what is classified as an antlerless? Both of these two deer here that you see, these are both young bucks, probably 6 to 9 months old or so. The one at the top may be a year and a half, probably not. But these would be classified as antlerless. Even though they do have a tiny bit of antler showing, they are not longer than 3 inches. And now I know that sounds arbitrary. What I like to do is if I can see antlers, I'm going to assume I'm not going to take that shot because I don't necessarily want to fill any sex in either sex, what most people call their buck tag on a deer like this. You certainly can, no issues at all. But if you're focusing and you want to try to save that buck tag for a bigger, more mature buck, these could be both harvested with an antlerless tag. And that it kind of makes sense because if a deer has, a little antler that's only 1.5 inches, 2 inches, it's impossible to see a field. You're just, in many cases, not going to see it unless you take your binoculars, back and forth and really hone in on it. So it is common to, again, harvest a button buck like we have here at the bottom, or a young spike with those antlers that are less than 3 inches. If those were over 3 inches, if it was 3¼ inches, that would be considered an antlered deer, and you could not fill an antlerless tag with it. So you better have an either sex tag in your pocket if you were to harvest that. And so that's why it's important to pay attention to the animal that you're harvesting and make sure you have the applicable tags and permits with you. And that's why I like to again, promote getting the combination where you have an either sex and an antlerless. That gives you both those options. A few other miscellaneous regulations: do not hold a permit or harvested game for other people. So if Curtis and I were out hunting together, I can't just give him my permits and have him carry them. They need to be on your person at all times while you're hunting. They can't be left in the truck. They can't be left at home. That doesn't do anybody any good. They need to be in your pocket while you're out hunting. And again, don't hunt areas without the proper licenses. Do not bait wildlife. I know I just kind of mentioned this a little bit. There's I don't want to say a gray area, but the way it's written is if it's a normal or standard agricultural practice, you can hunt it. So let's say there's an apple orchard, or maybe you're hunting a property and it's got 5 apple trees. You can go hunt over those apple trees. What you cannot do is go and take a bag of apples and dump those out for wildlife. So that's kind of the justification there, is whether it's a standard agricultural practice or not. So you can hunt over cornfields, but you can't go out and dump a bag of corn. I hope that makes sense.
Just adding that you can also plant wildlife specific food plots.
Right.
That's fine. Some people plant green browse or turnips or something like that. And that's the same as like Dan was talking about. It's standard agricultural practice.
Good clarification. Another big one that's common in other states, is very common in Wisconsin, quite common in Pennsylvania, is this concept of driving deer. And if you've never heard that, essentially what it is let's say I'm the hunter. I'm going to sit here in my stand. I'm going to have 4 or 5 buddies go, a 1/4 mile away, and they're all just going to walk through the woods to me and essentially try to scare every deer in that forest or in that section to me. And I try to take a shot as they move through. That is not legal in Illinois. Again, some states do allow it, whether it's Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. There are a few that do allow it, but Illinois does not. Another, not really regulation I want to highlight, but just a fact. There are not a lot of conservation officers out there. There's typically 1 per county. In some cases, 1 officer might cover 2 or 3 counties. And so oftentimes we are their eyes as hunters. So if you see something, whether it's you come across a deceased animal, or whether you come across somebody who's not hunting legally, or not ethically, because that's not a legal violation, but not hunting legally. Maybe they're shooting from a road, they're shooting over a road, they're baiting. They ask you to call, and so they have set up this tip line. The number will actually be on your deer permits. It's an anonymized system, so nobody will know that you are the one to call, but they recommend that if you see something, say something, because again, we are their eyes in the field. And again, we want to promote hunting in an ethical way, in a sustainable way. And these regulations are very nuanced, but they're designed for a reason, and they're founded in science so that we have this sustainable resource over time, so that we just don't have, one mass hunt where we wipe out everything in a year or two. This allows us to keep hunting and keep having these opportunities for generations to come.
I think it's important to keep in mind that since wildlife are a public trust resource and they're owned by everybody, poachers are effectively stealing from you
Mhm.
and all of us. So, would you report somebody if they broke into your car and stole your radio? I don't know if that happens anymore. Maybe it's the catalytic
Now
converter.
it's
Stole
catalytic
your
converter,
catalytic
yeah.
converter. Yeah, you're probably going to report that. Same way with poachers. Like Dan said, it's an image thing. You got this old school mentality of like the good old boys. It's time to get those out. The ethical hunters who are about conservation and doing things the right way. It's our time to shine. So don't feel bad about report, even if it's your buddy. You know, Sometimes you got to call people out and make them do the right thing.
Yep, yep.
And Dan, did you get a chance to answer this question? I was busy typing, but Peter asked if you have less than a 28-inch draw, can you still hunt?
Oh, great question. Yes, yes. And so the way that regulation is written is you have to have a certain draw weight at 28 inches. So if your draw length is 27 inches or 26, I think mine is actually at 28.5 or something. I'm a fairly short guy, but my draw weight is about 55 pounds. And so I'm completely legal there. So it's not necessarily the draw length, it's more that draw weight at that specific length. And that's again just to make sure that your equipment is actually powerful enough to penetrate and to humanely harvest an animal. Good question, though.
One of the reasons why I think they wrote that like that is to cover traditional archers as well. Because if you're familiar with traditional archery equipment, the further you pull it back, the stronger it is. So maybe there's a kid hunting with a bow that if you pulled it back to 30, it's 40 pounds and capable of complete pass through for a deer. But if the kid's just pulling it back 24 inches, maybe it's like 12 pounds or something.
Yeah,
So I think that's why that's written in. But yeah, as long as the poundage is over, then you're good, even if you're a little less than that.
great point. A few other kind of miscellaneous regulations: do not shoot across a road. No hunting by a dwelling without permission. So you want to be at least 300 yards from a dwelling. Now you can be closer to a road. You can hunt, if the property boundary is on the other side of the road, get off the road. You can be only 10 feet in the woods if you want, as long as there's not a dwelling there and that you're not shooting across that road. It's illegal to carry a loaded weapon outside of hunting hours. So the second that shooting light or shooting hours expires, unload your firearm and begin making your trek back to the vehicle. No target shooting at IDNR sites except at designated ranges. Unfortunately, it is, I don't want to say fairly common, but it does happen where people just go out and set up cans and things and start shooting. That is not allowed. They have designated ranges that you can use for that. A few post-harvest procedures. So let's say you're successful, you harvested your deer, you need to tag it. And so you can see here on this bottom picture, a deer permit attached to an antler. If it's an antlerless deer, you can attach it to the leg. Typically these deer permits are kind of like stickers, especially the firearm. Now your archery are not. Your archery, I recommend carrying zip ties with you. They actually have little holes in the tag itself, so you can run a zip tie through it and either zip tie it to the antler or to the leg. What I will say is do this the second you recover that animal. Don't start taking pictures, don't start field dressing it, don't start dragging it out. Get the tag on it immediately. Otherwise, you could technically be in violation of transporting an animal that is untagged. That tag needs to
And
be
I
on
just
it
want to,
ASAP.
since I worked for the DNR in Wisconsin, this was a very common thing that would come up from like animal rights activists. They would look through people's social media and try to find pictures of animals before the tags on there. Even if the person tagged it, the rule is written, you must affix the tag, first thing as soon as you get there. So if you take a picture before the tag, you are in violation, and there are folks that know to look for that. So good tip.
Yeah, that's a good point. And now you will have to report that. So obviously you put your tag on it, then you can go ahead and take your pictures. Then you can go ahead and take your, field dress it. You can start dragging it out if you want to. But once you get back to your home, or what I like to do is I just normally do it in the parking lot. Obviously, at that point, you're kind of exhausted after you've been hunting all day, and then you're transporting this 200-pound carcass back a half mile or 3/4 of a mile, however far you're hunting in there. You're going to be
And that's
exhausted. So I
just
normally
yourself. If you get a deer, it's doubled.
yeah, yeah. And so I like to kind of sit down in the car, recoup my thoughts, and at that point, it's a nice time to go ahead and telecheck that harvest and report that harvest. You can do it online, or you can do it through your phone, or like where you actually dial a number and do an automated voice thing. I personally don't like that. I do the online system where you just go to DNR's website. You can actually see the link right here, and you just click report your deer turkey harvest online, and then you can just type in all your info. And what I like is you will get a confirmation number that says you submitted this, and that does need to be written on the permit that's already affixed to the animal, as well as the permit, the remaining portion of the permit that's still in your pocket. I like to use my phone because then I can just easily screenshot that confirmation number and boom, I have it saved. I don't have to sit here and try to listen to somebody and try to write down a number, as my hands are, still a little bit bloody, probably sweaty. I'm still exhausted. So that's a great option. Now, carcass disposal is a question a lot of people have. The easiest way, and the way that IDNR recommends in terms of diseases, there's a lot of issues with just going out and dumping a deer carcass. Don't do it at public lands. That is illegal. Don't just go on the side of the road. You always see it. I was out at Clinton Lake last year duck hunting, and I pulled into the duck hunting parking lot, and there were 6 dead deer carcasses just dumped there. And it just gives a horrible look to hunters. It spreads disease. There's no need for it. The way to properly dispose of a carcass, either take it to a deer processor where they're going to process the entire animal for you. They're going to break down the meat. They'll get you your roast, your steaks, your sausages, your bratwurst, and all those things. Or if you're going to do, and they will dispose of the carcass themselves the correct way. Or if you're going to home process it, put it in your trash can. What I do at the point, you're not putting an entire deer carcass. At that point, it'll be in little chunks. You'll have bones, you'll have the 2 back quarters, and you'll have kind of the big chest cavity. I double and sometimes triple bag it in those big black industrial trash bags and just put it in my dumpster and send it out to the landfill. That's how DNR recommends doing it. And I've done it, well, I hate to admit it, but while I lived in apartments, I've done it that way. My neighbors never knew I hunted. I mean, not for, because I'm embarrassed of it or anything, just because, again, a lot of people don't like to see that. And so being a little conscious of that is important. And it's quite easy to just dispose of the carcass the correct way. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Curtis real quick, and he'll run us through some land access.
Yep, and right before talking about land access, want to hit this question here. So style pattern of camo. We'll talk
Oh,
about
good question.
equipment a little bit, but in general for deer, it does not matter. Okay.
At all.
Birds have good eyes. For birds, you could argue that maybe there's a little difference between camo patterns. For deer, yeah, wearing natural colors, wearing plaid shirts. Some of the best bow hunters that have ever lived never wore a piece of camo in their whole life. So that being said, wear what's comfortable for you, wear what you're confident in, wear what feels good and what keeps you comfortable, keeps you out in the stand. If you have money to afford nice camo, does it make you a little bit more comfortable? Probably, but can you hunt out there in just whatever you have for deer? Absolutely. Their nose is the thing that's going to get you, or seeing movement. It'll never, I don't care if you're wearing a basketball jersey from the Seattle Supersonics or whatever it is. If you're sitting out there and being still, the deer's probably going to walk right by you like you weren't even there. The second you move is when they see you, even if you're wearing the most fanciest camo that Sitka has to offer. So personally,
Yeah.
I like blocky camo just personally for all things, mostly for birds, because I think blocky breaks up your outline a lot better than intricate patterns, which are designed to sell to people, not really to fool wildlife. Just my opinion, but for deer, absolutely anything. Woodland camo to Sitka to a straight up brown. Well, you don't want to look like a deer, but
Yeah, I would avoid
natural,
brown. Yeah.
natural colors. Plaid shirts that break up your outline have been used for a long time before camo was available.
Yep, I do have a little bit to add, and kind of, I agree 100%. I'm kind of the same boat. I buy what's comfortable. What I would recommend is think of the noise that camo makes. That might sound a little weird, but there was a big push in like the late 1990s, early 2000s of this like kind of textured material that almost the jackets felt like, and every time you touch tree bark, it just kind of grabs on it and just makes a bunch of noise. So I try to find something that doesn't have a lot of noise when I'm, brushing against things, if I might brush against a tree or, even moving myself. So in a lot of cases, that's kind of what I shoot for more so than what the camo looks like, and kind of go with that. But like Curtis said, it's their smell. If you can avoid their nose, you're concealed.
And you got to find the happy medium with that, right? Because some stuff is really soft, so it's quiet, but then you collect every bird,
Yes,
cocklebur in
yes.
the woods, and then there's stuff designed to repel that, but it's noisy. So,
Yep.
well, somewhere in between is where the sweet spot lies, and we're
Honestly, I
all
wear
trying to
camo
find
that
it.
I bought from Rural King, and it works just fine. I've killed plenty of deer. I've killed plenty of what people would consider mature bucks, and I've killed plenty of turkeys and pretty much every critter you can legally hunt with it. So I wouldn't spend too much thought on it. I'd get more, thought on the pattern itself.
Yep, yep, good. And while we're doing questions, typical cost for a deer processor. I've never actually used one. You might be better at that, Dan, to
Yep. Yeah, so I typically I like to process my own deer, but I have a really good friend in Champaign County who actually runs a local deer processor. It's called Riverbend Wild Game. Great guy, great family that runs it. His name's Chuck Stites. He actually used to be a meat science professor at the University of Illinois, and so he knows his stuff. And typically, a lot of it depends on what you want. And so your typical deer process where they're just going to remove the meat from the animal and give it to you is typically about $100, which in all seriousness is not that bad. It's less things you have to worry about. You literally just drive up, fill out some paperwork, drop it off, and they give you a call in 2 or 3 weeks and say, hey, deer's done, and you come and grab it. Where it gets expensive is the specialty cuts, whether it's not specialty cuts, but specialty products. If they're making you jerky, if they're making you, he does some pulled venison where it's kind of, pulled pork style barbecue, which is very good. And bratwurst and snack sticks, that's where you get expensive because those you're typically purchasing by pound. And a lot of those are mixed with other meats. So they obviously have to add, pork fat to the sausages. They may add some beef fat in some cases. And so that does increase the cost. And so if you were to just, one year I went to him and I was like, hey, just give me the whole smorgasbord. I want to see what your best stuff is. Do me right. And it was about $300. But I got, 20 pounds of bratwurst, Italian sausage, snack sticks, the whole shebang. So it really just depends on the individual product that you want. But if you just want to get that meat off the animal and then get it back, expect to pay anywhere between 100 to 150 depending on the specific processor.
Yeah, I've always done the processing myself, so I've never taken it to a place for that. But I have definitely taken the deboned meat to processors who will accept it and
Yeah,
got some of that charcuterie stuff made
it's
because,
so good.
yeah, if you're saving money by doing the processing yourself, then look at it that you can spend a little money, splurge and get some of the fancy stuff like the jalapeno cheese, summer sauce, the
Oh,
those are the kind of things you can share with your friends in the duck blind or on the way to work. And yeah, really something special and something delicious, way better than any kind of summer sausage or jerky you can get at the
oh
store.
yeah.
I promise you that.
I mean, my lunch for probably the 4 months following deer season, my lunch for work is deer snack sticks, some cheese cubes, and some almonds or cashews. And it's, I mean, the best lunch you could ever have.
Breakfast of champions
You bet.
right there. All right, land access. This is an issue in Illinois. We can't beat around the bush. Dan's already mentioned it. We've got less public land than pretty much any other state in the Midwest. That makes it difficult. We also have a lot of big farms, not a lot of trees, just for finding public places to go. So land access is the biggest issue for most hunters, whether they're a brand new hunter or if they've been hunting for 60 years. This is primo uno. But we do have public land, and if you know how to look for it, if you know how to find it, if you know how to look for the regs, you can find these little jewels out there that can really have some awesome wildlife habitat and can lead to some great adventures. Do we have a ton of them? No, but they are out there, and we're going to help you hopefully be able to find these. So when you go to huntillinois.org, this is a great website. You can find all the area specific information, but you can also search either maybe you're interested in a certain species, maybe you're interested in a certain area. There's so many different ways to search. Maybe you're willing to drive. So instead of searching for just a specific county, you might want to search an entire region. And then through this web page, after you get through that, you can dictate it by the species that you want to hunt. So all these areas have different regulations. Maybe on some of them, squirrel hunting might be open, archery, deer hunting's not. So you do want to make sure that you read through there and see what's allowed. But the nice thing about that filter feature is you can filter out most of the ones that don't allow what you're looking for before you get there. And now, this being 2022 is the age of like apps and information. There are some awesome apps out there, even beyond this website, for finding both public and private ground. And a couple of them that are sponsors of Learn to Hunt for a couple of events. So definitely don't mind saying their name, but Hunt Stand and Onyx Mapping are two mapping apps that are super popular in the hunting industry, and they take your hunting up a notch for sure. And they have just a subscription that you buy, and it can either be statewide or all 50 states. They both have different features. They're both great. But what they both allow you to do is they allow you to find public land. Public land can be marked, whether it's state, federal, county, anything like that should be marked and delineated on there. Now, they may not have the regulations. You might have to search and find those on your own. But once you find the public land, even if it's a piece of county property, then you can search it up and generally find the regs or maybe a contact number where you can call and talk to somebody. But on top of the public land, these apps like Hunt Stand and Onyx are going to use tax assessor data to also display land ownership. So this is a great tool. Not to say that it's easy to get private hunting permission. I've been in Illinois now for a while. I do not have private hunting permission for deer, that's for sure. So it's not something that's easy.
Same,
But
and I've been here 7 years.
yeah, and you're such a likable guy.
I know, that smile.
So if anybody out there is willing to donate, we're ready to hunt and travel. But anyway, once you know you're driving by, maybe you see a field just covered down in deer and it's not too far away from your place. You can look up and find out who owns that. And then in some cases, you can contact them and begin to build a relationship. And to be honest, getting deer hunting permission is not easy. I generally would try to start with something else as a way to get in. Maybe that's squirrel hunting, maybe that's shed hunting. Maybe you see that landowner out doing something and it's something you can help with. They're out working, it's a Saturday, don't even ask, just come and help them. Help them for a couple hours and then ask and see how many people tell you yeah. So it is possible to get private land permission. Getting that landowner name on the plat books or the Onyx or Hunt Stand is definitely a good way to make those connections. Obviously, 96% of Illinois is privately owned. So if you are open to asking for permission, you can open up a lot new possibilities. And if you do get lucky and get permission on one of those, then you have a place where you don't have to worry about the level of competition that you might at public lands. Also, IDNR has this nice little access card just to clear up if landowners have questions about, oh, I would let you go, but I don't want you to hurt yourself and then sue me for everything I got. Well, that's not the way it works. That you can carry this card to make them feel good that you were saying that, all realistic liability is on the hunter, not the landowner. You just want permission to hunt. And sometimes this card can help set landowners at ease if they're worried about that.
Yeah, I will say 95% of the time when you get a no, it's going to be either A, they've already got somebody hunting there, whether it's a nephew, a grandkid, a friend, something like that. Or the second most common is going to be liability. And again, like Curtis said, it's not really an issue. There is written laws in place that would already protect that landowner, but this is just a little bit of peace of mind. And I want to just share a quick story real quick in terms of getting private land access. Some of you may remember Adam Wojciechowski. He used to work for the Learn to Hunt program. He recently just took a new job in Iowa. And so he's now out there trying to learn, how to hunt Iowa. And he has developed a pretty cool system of reaching out to landowners. He's doing what most people won't take the necessary step to do. A lot of people either call or just show up at their door. He's gone so far as he's drafting a written letter. He's mailing it ahead of time. He's asking them to contact them to schedule a time. And in that envelope, he's created what he calls a hunter's resume. And so it's got this list of all his different credentials, hunter safety, firearm instructor. Not everyone's going to have all these credentials, but it's putting something in their hand that sets you apart from the 15 other people who may have asked that season already. And he's already had more success in a month than I've had in 7 years in Illinois. So something he's doing is working. And so I do recommend if you want to really pursue private land, if you can get the access, it can be a honey hole. You don't have to worry about all these lottery applications for site-specific permits, because there's a lot of county permits left for firearm or even for archery. You just less things to worry about. So that option is there, but try to do what kind of sets you apart from the rest.
For sure. One little thing to add to that, you see some of these companies advertising for business cards super cheap. The different
Yeah,
companies that advertise online, sometimes you can get 100 or 500 business cards for an introductory price of like $10.
right.
Make a hunting business card. Even if you're new to hunting, you can use that as a selling point. Put a couple pictures of yourself, your family, people you might be hunting with, and just be like, hey, I'm a new ethical hunter. Whatever you have on there, even if you don't have quite the credentials that Adam might have to list, you can have some things, and it's going to be something that sets you apart and something to remember you by.
Hmm.
So even if somebody says no, you might be the only person that handed them a business card. They hang that up, and the first time that the person that they gave permission to ruts up a field or does something that they see as disrespectful, guess who's getting the call? The person who left the card. So a lot of different ways to skin a cat. All right,
Yep.
this is a deer webinar. Cat webinar. Okay, here we go. IRAP. This is another one. This is like a fusion between private and public land, kinda. So this is private land, but it's private land that landowners are basically accepting like a state or a federal payment to allow public access on. So these are great. This is realistically, this is the way that most states are going to increase access, because they're not making any more land. Maybe Hawaii still is. I don't know if they're still pumping out new islands or not, but we're not making any new land in Illinois. So real estate prices are not likely to go down, and there's more and more people competing over buying those. Is the state going to be able to buy much more property in the future? Who knows? But more than likely, the best bet to increase more access is by using the landowners that are there, that are using it for things other than hunting, and give them a little bit of money to allow hunters to come out there and treat it like public land for that one part. So one thing I got to say about these, make sure everybody who's out there needs to treat these better than it's your own land, because these are a gift, and if we as hunters can go out there and show these landowners that we can do this stuff respectfully, and if we see a piece of trash, we pick it up, don't leave your shotgun shells, all these things, there's a good chance that we could see more and more access in IRAP in the future. But if it's the other way, and it's a bunch of slobs, then we start to lose people who want to join the process. So ethics, super important here, but just look at the numbers, 16,000 acres in 38
And
counties.
I should say that figure is probably a year and a half old. I know it's substantially more. I know it's over 20,000 now, and probably even higher than that. So they're always adding new properties.
Nice. Yeah. So you're talking about a substantial amount of land to hunt on, and just private landowners open it up.
And you get sole access to it. If you draw a deer permit, my wife drew an IRAP permit about 3 years ago. We got a piece of property that was 50 acres. We were the only ones allowed on it for 2 weeks. I mean, you can't ask for anything better.
That's like an Airbnb for hunting almost, you know, that's pretty
That's the
cool.
marketing
For hunting almost, you know, that's pretty
that's the
cool.
marketing pitch right there. Airbnb for hunters.
That might be trademarked or something, but yeah, that's awesome. And we should also mention that the IRAP goes beyond deer. So
Yes,
other
yes.
critters you can look for properties to hunt other critters as well. But this is a deer webinar, so we're talking about deer. Look for your signage. Purple paint means the same thing as a no trespassing, no hunting type sign. So Illinois does have a purple paint law. If you see trees that are painted purple, that's not some kind of homage to the Minnesota Vikings or anything like that. That's the common. It's known as the purple paint law. That means no trespassing. That means the public land is over and now you cannot come here without
And
permission.
we should clarify, the property in Illinois does not have to be marked. There are some states where it has to be marked or you can access it. Illinois is not. So it is your responsibility as the hunter to know where the property boundaries are. Even they may not all be marked. And some of these DNR sites, if it's, you're in the very back section, you may have signs that were probably once good looking signs, but have been shot up or rusted out and are not even there anymore. So it's your responsibility as the hunter to know what those boundaries are.
For sure. Good point. So yeah, these signs are our helpers to help us know where these boundaries are, but don't just rely on them. So know where you're going and always have a plan. But now we can kind of start to talk a little bit about habitat. And when we're talking about the habitat, the ecology, equipment, and all this stuff. We're going to get into these things in way more detail down the line. So Deer 102 is where we're going to take a lot of the regs part out and just focus on this. So we're going to give you all a brief taste here today, but we hope a whole bunch of you will join us for Deer 102. That's going to be coming up, and we'll dive into this stuff much in a much deeper way. But
And my favorite webinar coming up is the deer stand placement strategies, where we'll kind of take all this information, we'll look at maps, we'll show you, we'll go through hunts that we've been on, that things that worked for us, things that have failed, and really highlight some of these different tactics and techniques.
yeah, it's going to be a fun one too. So this whole little series, but starting off, what is deer habitat? Well, basically most of Illinois is deer habitat. They're pretty generalized, but if you can find a good mix, a little bit of old forest, a little bit of young forest, you got some grass for cover, maybe a little bit of ag, then you're talking ideal habitat. So a lot of Illinois is really good habitat because we have a whole lot of ag, whole lot of well, I shouldn't say a whole lot of forest cover, but we do
Enough.
have enough to sustain a deer population. Maybe not enough for like a marten population or a species that's reliant upon timber, but we've got enough for deer, so we're doing pretty good. And deer are generalists in what they eat. Of course, we always think about the ag because that's the damage component that we see a lot, but tree buds, grasses, the native forbs and stuff that are out there. And then of course, a mass crop that's looking pretty healthy this year is acorns.
Very
So,
healthy.
yeah, your mass that grows out there, your acorns, your walnuts, your hickory nuts, and even stuff like Dan mentioned before, apple trees, persimmons. I've found some, we actually snacked on some persimmons
Yeah,
in
yeah.
our 3D archery shoot a couple days ago. They were pretty yummy. Some pawpaws. I'm seeing some, I have not found a pawpaw this year, but I am seeing some folks are finding them. So keep your eye out. Called the Midwest banana by some people, but tasty little fruit if you can find them before the squirrels get to them.
Yeah, and one thing we should mention here too, we get asked it a lot. I probably should have added it to the slide and just forgot, is water. A lot of people, especially if you watch some of these Western hunting shows or follow a Western hunter, they focus a lot on water because that's a limiting resource out there. In Illinois, it is not. Food and water is not a limiting resource in the vast majority of properties. Water is abundant. They can, obviously there's creeks, there's rivers, there's ponds, but deer are also quite capable of getting water from just feeding. They can feed on, if they know they're, dehydrated, they will focus on foods that have a high moisture content so they can get some of that moisture back. So water is not necessarily something I personally focus on too much when trying to find a spot to deer hunt.
Yeah, in general, Midwest and the East, you'll never see anybody hunting water holes because there's water everywhere.
Yeah.
You know, get up in the morning and walk your dog, and your shoes are covered in dew every single morning.
Yep.
A lot of deer maybe don't even have to drink free water because they're just getting it like that. So good point. Now I'll get a little bit into behavior. This is where it starts to get fun. And this terminology that you'll hear a lot is the rut. The rut is just it's basically the deer's breeding cycle that makes the bucks go crazy. And so this is a really fun time to hunt. This is where deer hunters are focused on hunting. I know, like my dad, who wants to take a vacation each year to deer hunt, he always wants to do it in that peak pre-rut activity. Um, and so a couple things to remember about the rut. This thing is photo period driven, so it's daylight driven. Some people will tell you, oh, it's the weather, it's the moon, it's all. No, that's really overcomplicating it. This is yeah, strictly deals with photo periods, so it's pretty reliable each year. And really, it's the pre-rut activity that most hunters are excited about, because this is when all the bucks are competing for the does. So maybe the does are acting pretty natural, although maybe they're moving a little bit more because they're more moved around by the bucks. But this is the period of time, which generally you're talking like the last couple weeks of October, first week of November is usually right in that prime time. These are the times when you see bucks spar, see bucks fight, and you might be sitting in a place and you see more bucks than you've ever seen. You know, I've hunted a place maybe every day for 20 days, and you just see it, you think you know what deer are there, and then all of a sudden it's October 30th and you just saw 14 bucks that you've never seen in the past 3 months of having cameras out on this place.
And they're running around like rabbits. I mean, this bottom picture here on the right depicts it. They are literally just running circles. Just it's incredible.
And a lot of fun activities that you don't get to see at other times a year. So and this is also where some new hunters might ask it, like, do you need to be worried about deer doing this? And I never want to say that you don't have to be worried about a wild animal, but you're really safe. Deer are so accustomed to humans being a predator that as soon as you show yourself as a human, I don't care how high that testosterone is pumping, 99.999 times they're going to be running away from you as
Yeah.
fast as they can. A lot of
Just
people
just
see the,
don't dump doe pee on yourself or on your boots,
yeah,
and you
the
probably
one
have
video,
nothing to
right?
worry about.
Everybody's seen that one video where the deer's like
Yeah.
slap fighting this dude from the 80s who's just rolling around on the ground, and he's tough because people from the 80s are tough, but
Yeah. Yeah.
so I'm sure he's still around. But anyway, not a legitimate fear, so don't be afraid. Rattling, calling, that can excite deer at this time, and they may look a little frightening, but don't fear. If they do get a little too close for comfort, alert yourself as a human and they'll take off. Now, early October is going to be a different strategy. So now we're not quite in this rut time. These deer are really just focused on feeding. Um, Especially once it starts to get cold, the urgency to build up fat reserves. The deer know that lean times are coming, so it's time to eat. They're going to focus on a high productive food source, and so they can be relatively easy to pattern in the early season. You don't see quite the level of activity like fighting and calling and sparring that you will during the peak pre-rut. Um, but they have a more established routine probably, so they could be easier. Feel like, well, they're feeding here, they're bedding here, my wind's going this direction, I'll just get in this route, and that's my strategy. And that's really all the strategizing you need to do in the early October. Probably don't need to bring your rattling antlers, your
Mm-mm.
grunt tube. You can if you want, if that makes you feel better, but not a whole lot of productivity for that type of stuff in the early season. It's all that ritualistic feeding. And obviously don't look past the mass crops. If you've got a good white oak stand that's just covered down with acorns, that's going to be just as good of a feeding location as that cornfield or bean field or alfalfa or whatever else you might see out
It
there.
may even be better because it might offer a little bit more seclusion and kind of comfort while they're
Sure.
feeding. And that's a big part of deer hunting is, is knowing not necessarily what they're feeding on or where they're feeding, but kind of why, because they will really drastically shift their feeding behavior as pressure starts to pick up. They know it's like a light switch. They go from having free run of the place for 5 months, nothing's out here. You know, you may get a hiker and a dog that come through at noon. Well, now they're being woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning by this random metal clanking loud object with flashlights heading everywhere. They start to pick up on pressure. They start to pick up on people being in the woods, and that really does impact their movement. And that's why early October can be so powerful, because they're still, like Curtis said, stuck on that bed to feed pattern that they've been on since, summer. Obviously, they'll shift their food sources as corn gets, harvested and things like that. But pay attention to what pressure is going to do, because it will impact where they're feeding and when. You'll see a lot more nighttime activity and less daylight activity as you kind of progress.
And this will be evident on trail cameras. If you do
Mhm.
have a trail camera, a lot of times checking your trail camera pictures is just as fun as hunting. So a lot of fun to get out and put those out. And you'll see that, especially on public land, once the season starts, maybe all the spots that you thought were the best prime spots, the scrapes out in the open, they might get abandoned because everybody and their brother and sisters hunting right there. So it's some of those like secondary spots that you found, like, oh, this looks decent,
Mhm.
not a ton of activity. But then once the season starts and they move from that maybe primary scrape, then that new spot might become the primary. So definitely utilize your trail cameras. It can be a lot of fun and it'll teach you a lot about animal movement as well. But now we're getting into this pre-rut time, and now movements are more randomized. So a lot of times does are still going to be focused on this bed to food movement pattern. They might be getting pushed around a little bit more by bucks, getting annoyed. A lot of us remember middle school, same kind of thing, I'm sure. um, but yeah, this is when you really start doing some of the, I don't know if you call them more advanced tactics, but you can utilize the rattling antlers. You can have a little bit more success with the grunt tubes. Um, you can utilize stuff like scents and mock scrapes and all that, because the deer, yeah, this is their matchmaking time. So once their testosterone, estrogen levels start to rise, the deer definitely know it. This is like their one little window to make a match. So they're all out trying to be, mostly the bucks, they're trying to be as they're trying to hit up as many does as possible and just be like, hey, you know what, I'm around, just so you
Yep.
know, I'll
Yep.
be around, if you get the feeling good, I'm here. And there's a whole lot of that, and it's this is when you get to see some of those cool interactions. Like I've seen some deer spar and knock their antlers together, and even playing around doing that. It might be small bucks doing it, but that's always cool and neat things to see. And so even the little button bucks, their testosterone will be
Oh
going
yeah, and they,
high.
they
They
don't they
don't know
don't
what to
understand
do
what's
yet.
happening. They're like,
Oh yeah, but they'll just be grunting and like
yeah.
running around and ramming stuff and acting like a goat at the petting zoo. It's crazy. And they'll be running off deer that are way bigger than them. And yeah, it's just fun to watch. Hormones are crazy things.
They are, and I'll say, we get asked often if we had one single day to hunt during the hunting season. For me, it's a pretty simple answer. It's Halloween. Um, Late October, I have had the most success I've ever had in tree stands hunting anywhere between October 29th to like November 7th. But for me personally, Halloween just seems to be one of those kind of magical days. And just to kind of explain Curtis's kind of comment there about their hormones just a little bit. Quick story, I was hunting in Missouri a few years back. I was up in my stand and it was probably 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So it wasn't, I still had 2 hours of daylight left or so. Wasn't really expecting anything to come through at that moment. I was just kind of sitting there enjoying the birds, enjoying the sun on my face, and I start to hear leaves. I'm like, okay. And all of a sudden, a doe, I mean, just comes hauling as fast as I've ever seen a doe run right by me. And she just stops. And she started to do a telltale sign. If when you see a doe doing this, chances are there's a buck chasing her. Her ears started to rotate back a little bit, and she kept checking over her shoulder. She kept looking back to where she came from. And she was in front of me for probably 5 or 10 minutes, and I could have certainly taken a shot, but I knew, just judging by her body language, that something was moving her and something was chasing her. A few minutes later, here comes a nice 10-point buck that comes into about 12 yards. I'm in my stand. I draw back. My arrow was not correctly nocked on my string. And so that arrow tumbled down, and I'm in a ladder stand at this point that has metal rungs. That arrow fell down the tree stand, hit at least 3 or 4 of those ladder rungs on the way down, making a ton clang, clang, clang as it goes down. That buck was so focused on that doe that he never heard that. I had time to reach behind me, grab another arrow off the quiver, re-nock it, redraw, aim, and take a shot, all while he's standing at 12 yards in front of me. And so that's the level of hormones that have overtaken these deer, as they become just almost numb to every other stimulus that's around them, and they just focus on that one doe. And what can be really fun about hunting late October is if you're in the spot that has one of the first does that comes into estrus, what most people will call a hot doe. So she is fully in estrus. The bucks can smell that. That's when you're going to have those hunts like Curtis was talking about, where you may have 15 or 16 bucks, because bucks are going to come from across the county to find that first doe that's in heat, because they think they're the dominant mature buck. And that's where you can use a lot of these lures and calling strategies that we'll get into in, the 102 webinar and the tree stand webinar, to really start to trick these animals and really convince them that, hey, there's a hot doe here, or hey, there's another buck with a doe here, but I'm the dominant one, so I want to come over here and try to push that one away. And so it's a really fun time to be in the woods.
Well,
Now, as we
yeah.
progress,
Oh, I was just gonna say that I love the Halloween time, but one positive about the day after Halloween, you can bring all your kids' Halloween candy in the stand with you, and
there you
you
go.
won't be hungry.
I like it. So moving on to kind of early November, mid-November, this is what most people call peak rut. It's kind of November 7th through the 14th. And again, like Curtis said, it's based on photo period. So that amount of daylight in a specific day is what triggers this hormonal response. So it's typically around the exact same time frame every single year. Now, weather may impact movement. If it's really hot, they may move more in the evening, or they may be in areas where they don't have to move as much, just to conserve, caloric energy and preserve their heat loss. So those things can certainly impact movement, but they don't impact rut. But what's really fun about this time is you'll see what you kind of see here. I took this picture at Clinton Lake a few years back. I probably should have picked my bow up at that point, but it was just such a cool sight to watch this doe just kind of sneak across this field. And she kept looking over her shoulder, and then all of a sudden you just see these antlers come, and he was just right on her tail, and he basically followed her everywhere she stepped. He basically stepped. They are almost in lock toe at this point, and he was actually at this point starting to tend her. So I could tell she was receptive to breed, he was receptive to breed, and she wasn't running away from him like you may see in kind of late October. She was a lot more receptive. And so what they'll do is they'll go off and do their own thing, and he may be with that individual doe for 48 hours, anywhere between 24 to 48 hours. They'll breed multiple times. And that's why I find mid-November, I think it gets overhyped, for lack of a better term, because in a lot of cases, these deer are going to be locked down with a doe. A buck's going to be locked down with a doe. I mean, you can certainly still have success, but if you're shooting for that prototypical rut activity style hunt, I would focus on late October and early November more so than kind of the mid portion of that month, because things will start to slow down. You'll still see activity, but again, they'll be kind of locked up doing a lot of their breeding and doing that behavior, rather than the chasing and the seeking that you really see in October.
A lot of times, if you monitor any like deer hunting Facebook group
Oh,
or social
yes.
media group, the lockdown period will become evident because it shows up on people's trail cameras, because you're just having deer activity going crazy, and then there'll be like 2 to 3 4 days where the activity all of a sudden gets cut down to almost nothing, and that's what the lockdown period. So that's actually when the deer are breeding, but it's a time where activity is a lot lower than the periods around it. So
Yeah, and while they're in this tending phase, they're going to be in thick cover, and they're going to be essentially locked down in that area. That buck will not let that doe leave, and she will stay there. Again, they'll breed multiple times. They'll maybe get up and stretch their legs, but they're not going to go feed. If they do feed, it's just going to be right around their area, so they're not covering a lot of ground. But now as we move towards kind of late November and into December, this is when you start to see another shift. You'll hear what a lot of people call is the second rut. I can't remember if we have a slide on it. I do not. In 102, I know we do. But there's what a lot of people call the second rut. And what a lot of people, I think, kind of misinterpret this as a big increase in activity. There is a substantial increase in activity, but typically what you're going to see is the vast majority of does are going to be bred during this first rut. So during that kind of mid-November. Through late November and into December, it's typically around mid-December because it's obviously a full menstrual cycle after that first estrus cycle. What you're going to see is a lot of those younger does. So maybe a fawn was a little bit too young during that first rut. She may now go into estrus during the second rut, and you may see a little uptick in activity. Again, the vast majority of adult does have already been bred at this point. There will still be a few that are still re-kicking it and having another estrus cycle, but it doesn't have the same impact that the first one does. And also, you're later in the season. I mean, just by a numbers game, there's a lot less deer on the landscape. At this point, there's probably been 100,000 or so deer harvested in the state. So your numbers do decline a little bit throughout the season. So what I really focus on during what most people consider the late season, I don't really worry about second rut too much. I may try to use some lures to try to sneak in, to try to see if I can get a buck who's just completely out of his mind, stupid, and still very hormonal. See if you can trick them there. But what I focus on is food. Food is going to become scarce in the landscape. They'll have, the acorns and the mass crop like Curtis was talking about will have started to rot and be consumed. There won't be much left. The corn and the beans will all be harvested. There may be a little bit of waste grain left. So focus on the food. And how do you find the food in the late season? Find where the deer are going. The late season, especially if you get a snow event, I hunt that next day, because what that tells me is I can go walk around that entire property, look for sign. I will know where deer are within, where they were within 15 hours from now. So they were hitting this field last night. Chances are there's still food here. Chances are they're going to hit it again. And when you find that food source, it's not just 2 or 3 deer hitting it during the late season. It's numbers. I was at a piece of public land that's a very small piece of public land. It's about 800 acres or so. I counted 42 deer in one little 3-acre field because that was probably the only food source that was available. It was after a snow event, so a lot of things were covered, but deer knew there was food here, and they went there in numbers. And so that can be a really good way to focus a late winter, late season hunt, because they have to, especially the bucks, they need to recoup. They need to build up their fat reserves. A buck can lose up to 25% of his body weight during rut. He's not feeding. He's not doing a lot of bedding. He's focused on one thing, and that's breeding as many does as he can. And like we mentioned, they will cover miles to find other does in estrus during this period. And so they have basically depleted a lot of their fat reserves and really need to build it up again before winter comes. And pay attention to weather.
With a really high doe to buck ratio, so a whole bunch of does per bucks, where they actually have die-off of bucks after the rut because they're running around breeding so much that they've lost their fat reserves to make it through the winter. So having a healthy buck to doe ratio is definitely good for more reasons than one. But what I got to just pitch the snow. You definitely need to go out in the woods after the snow. The snow takes away all the night secrets. So all the things that happen that we never get to see, you go out in the snow and you can see them. And if you can start to learn to read tracks, you can find out what everything's doing, what the mice and the owls and the foxes and the coyotes and the deer. Snow is great. It's like a story written by the natural world.
Yes.
It's fresh and new every time it falls from the sky. So even if it's not hunting season, if you like to learn about animals after a snow, get out there and see what you can find.
And I'll tell you what, it does make blood tracking very easy.
A lot easier, that's right.
So we'll kind of, I know we're running close on time. Oh, running over time. Sorry about that. We'll kind of quickly go over some quick scouting tactics. Just kind of want to talk about deer sign a little bit. The 95% of the sign that I'm looking for is going to be tracks, like you see here in the bottom right, so their footprints or their scat. Some people will focus on beds. I personally don't try to identify an actual deer bed. if I find a bedding area, I personally like to stay the heck away. I don't want to get into that bedding area, get my scent all over it, and basically disturb that bedding site. If I know they're bedding, if I have a good idea of their bedding, on this side of the ridge, that's enough for me. I can plan around that. I don't need to see their bedding in that, next to that tree. For me, it just makes it a little too easy for them to pick you off because you're depositing a lot of scent. Your boots carry scent, and every time you're walking around, you're depositing scent. You have oils on your fingers as you brush against trees and grasses. You're depositing scent out there. So just kind of keep that in mind. Rubs and scrapes, you'll start to see these really start to pick up on the landscape towards the latter portion of October. Around October 20th is when I really start looking for rubs and scrapes. You can certainly see them before then, but they don't get a ton of use. And you can certainly hunt near these, and we'll talk a lot about this in 102 and in the deer stand placement. But oftentimes rubs and scrapes are going to be visited during nighttime hours, not during legal shooting light. So just kind of keep that in mind, that just because you find a very active rub line or a scrape, it doesn't mean a buck's going to be there during hunting hours. Like we mentioned, what's really important about deer hunting is playing the proper wind. We always want to make sure that the wind is blowing from the deer to us. We don't want our scent blowing to the deer. Deer have a very substantial olfactory system, and they can detect scent from a long ways off. So always make sure that wind, the easiest way to remember it is obviously when you're sitting in your hunting spot, you're looking where you expect the deer to be. So we want that wind in our face. So that always means that wind is blowing behind us. Now, there are certain instances where that's a lot more challenging, especially if you're trying to cover an area, but try to play that wind as best you can. And there are certain products that we'll discuss in the next webinars that can help reduce some of your odor and kind of help cover some of that scent. Those can be effective, but if you could play the wind right, you don't need any of those products. The wind is going to be your biggest favor. One of the big things I really want to highlight is don't hunt over a bedding area. Now, it can certainly be effective. You may have a successful sit where you see a bunch of activity, but chances are you're going to disturb that bedding area, and it may cause them to shift and to not use it anymore. They'll eventually come back to it in a few weeks or something, a few days. But I try to avoid getting right on top of the bedding area. So you can see here in this example, we have what I call these natural funnels and pitch points. And Illinois it's made up of a lot of these. We have a lot of fence rows and these kind of little meandering, narrow strips of timber. Deer use those religiously to travel. And I call those kind of travel corridors because, again, they just funnel this travel. They don't like to walk, straight across the field. They certainly can if they're feeding, and they will occasionally, but typically they like to follow inside of cover. And so if you can pick out where they're bedding, where they're feeding, and you have a little strip in between, oftentimes you can put yourself in a real good opportunity for success. Another good option is here you can see we have an illustration of maybe they're feeding on some acorns down in this kind of river bottom, and they're bedding up in here. And we have a couple diagrams showing good wind or bad wind. There are many instances where I'll have a perfect setup where I know a buck is in an area where I want to hunt, but the wind is not correct. I will not hunt that day. I will just take that day off because, in my opinion, and this is true with does too, I shouldn't just say bucks, they become educated over time. And if you really start to educate these deer and you start to hunt in a specific area on a bad wind, it may cause them to adjust their travel routes, and then you're basically starting back from square one. So there's many instances where I will avoid hunting a certain spot because of a wind direction. Now, when I'm scouting, I like to go around and pick different spots. So I try to have at least a spot that I can hunt from every wind direction, so that at least gives me some flexibility, because we all have busy schedules. You only have so many days to hunt. At least that way, when you have the time, you can at least find a spot to hunt. Movement corridors, like we discussed, are very important. Again, these deer don't like to cover across the terrain without having too much cover. They like cover. It's their sanctuary. It's their safety. And oftentimes they'll either stay in the cover or they will hug right next to it. Deer are what we call edge species. So they like this intersection between two habitat types. So whether it's a forest and a prairie, they really like to reside right on that edge between those two habitat types because A, it provides a lot of cover, and B, there's a lot of plant diversity because you have two different types. You have the forest and a prairie, and it can also be a prairie to a grassland. It doesn't just have to be a forest to a prairie, but they really like this edge habitat. A couple scouting tools. We've already talked a little bit about plat books. Those are what Curtis referred to on the Hunt Stand or Onyx that show that land assessor data that shows who owns land. There's a bunch of government websites out there. We've talked about one with the huntillinois.org website. There's a really good map tool that they've built in there. Obviously, a GPS unit can be helpful. Your phone is better than most GPSs these days that you can buy, especially in terms of getting cell phone coverage and all that kind of thing. So definitely look into that. Trail cameras can be of big use. Be cautious if you're using them on public land. Theft does occur. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, when you're going out scouting, there are a few questions to kind of ask yourself. First, what is the seasonal behavior? And again, we've kind of addressed all these things, but these are kind of the thought processes that's going through my head as I'm out there scouting. And there's a couple questions on here that I think are really important to ask yourself. One is, where might other people hunt? We kind of talked about how pressure can really impact deer movement. And if you find areas on the property that are, for whatever reason, maybe it's too far from a parking lot, maybe there's a steep ridge that most people don't want to climb up. If you can find these little pocketed areas where other hunters aren't going to go, chances are you're going to find activity because deer will just kind of naturally gravitate towards these areas that are unpressured. Really another good one is, what gear will I need to hunt here? When I'm out scouting, I'm either mentally or even typing on my phone or on a little notebook of what I might need in this site. Is this specific hunting spot going to be a rut spot? Is it going to be a late season? Should I bring a climber stand? Should I just hunt on the ground? Having this kind of list allows you to when you go back to plan your hunt, you already have all this kind of done, and it makes things a lot easier. And don't forget to scout outside of season. A lot of people only scout during the season. My scouting is going on year round, especially even after the season. You can learn a lot about deer activity, what deer made it through the season, especially in the winter, as you see, as we talked about the impact of snow and how easy it makes to track and scout. So don't be afraid to scout outside of your standard hunting season. And so here's kind of my school of thought. I pick a specific area. I try to identify potential habitat, which is what we're going to discuss in 102 and in the deer stand placement. And then I get on the ground and I go through and look for good habitat, and I monitor these spots. I continue to monitor these spots because, again, deer are always evolving. Their patterns are always changing. And if you rely on what you saw in September on a December hunt, chances are you're not really setting yourself up for success. So continue to monitor these spots. One little map I want to show you. This is kind of an example of a piece of public land that I regularly hunt. Try not to give away too many of my spots, to be honest. But here you can see we have a nice little kind of oxbow style bend in the river. And we also have this ridge. So if you're unfamiliar with topographic maps, you can see these kind of brown contour lines here. Those are showing elevation changes. The closer those lines are together, the steeper that slope is. So you can see here on this backside, kind of on the southwest portion of this map, that's a fairly steep slope. Now, I will say this right here is a fairly steep slope. It just doesn't really show it on a topographic map. That's a terrible arrow. But it is a fairly steep slope. And I want to highlight how impactful terrain can be on deer movement. So this big field over here was a food plot. It was planted in like milo and a mix of corn, and it was very evident that deer were feeding in it quite regularly. And you can see this field kind of up here that I'm circling right now is this really overgrown field. You can start to see a lot of this woody growth starting to reclaim that field. That tells me instantly bedding area. And so when I scouted this spot, I went in and kind of circled around this area. I actually kicked up a bunch of does. I noticed, okay, there's deer bedding in there. And then I know now where they're feeding. I know where they're bedding and where they're feeding. And in this specific example, this is about as prototypically perfect of a funnel as you can get. If deer want to get from the bed to the food source, chances are they're going to walk through that funnel. They don't like to cross water. That's a river with a fairly steep bank. We have a steep ridge on the south slope. Deer are lazy. They're like us. They'll take the path of least resistance. And so in this case, you have these kind of two convergence between the river and the ridge that just naturally funnels all the deer movement. So anything going from food to bed or from bed to food, chances are they're going to walk right through that funnel. And I've had several successful hunts in this exact spot. And so I just show this to illustrate how impactful the terrain is and how being able to look at a map, understand that terrain, because I knew about this funnel before I even identified that they were feeding over here and that they were bedding in this area. I was able to pick up on that funnel because I was like, oh, I mean, if they want to go and kind of skirt this, they're going to have to go through there. They don't like to go straight up a slope. They certainly will if they're in danger and things like that, and occasionally just for fun. But 9 times out of 10, they like to take the path of least resistance. Here's another example, kind of a similar type scenario, but what I really wanted to highlight here is what I call ridge points. And we'll spend quite a bit of time on this in the deer stand placement section, but you can see these 2 ridge points that I'm kind of highlighting here. So we have this gimlet branch kind of creek that kind of slopes down through here and runs alongside in this valley or in this holler. And you have this ridge basically on either side of it. And when you find areas where this ridge kind of penetrates out and really kind of sticks out into that valley a little bit, that is a very common buck bedding area. Bucks really like to bed in areas like this because imagine a deer is sitting up on this ridge. He's bedded there. He's looking down. He's facing down. He now sees any danger that's in front of him. And he is only going to use a bed like that if the wind is coming from the south. So now he's got the wind blowing behind him. So anything behind him, he's instantly going to pick up those scent molecules from. He's watching what's in front of him. He's always listening. In addition, we have what we call thermals. So thermals are kind of these rising columns of air, right? Warm air rises. And so as the surface of the earth warms up in the day, it creates these rising columns of air. And you can kind of see them when you see, vultures out there circling. A lot of times they are in those thermals because they can just sit there and soar because that air is constantly moving. So in a case like this on a ridge point bed, he also has these thermals pulling up any scent molecules from down beneath that valley. And so he is very well protected in an area like this. He's got the vision down below. He's got the thermals pulling up his scent molecules. He's got the dominant wind blowing from behind him. So he can hear anything coming up behind him. He can smell anything coming up behind him. And he's in a very safe and secure spot. So those are the kind of things I'm thinking of when I'm looking at a map. And again, this is just kind of a quick snippet. We'll go into much greater detail in the 102 and in the deer stand placement webinars, but a lot to think about there. But with that, I think that wraps up our webinar today. A couple upcoming events I wanted to highlight. Obviously, this is part 1 of our webinar series. We have Deer Hunting 102 on September 20th at 11 a.m. Deer stand placement we're going to do in the evening, so we hope a lot of people can join us live for that one. I know we have a pretty good turnout today, so I'm impressed. Thank you. That starts at 7 p.m. And then a really cool event you've probably seen or heard of, and if you haven't, it's called Hunt Camp. This is kind of a big collaborative effort between us at Illinois Learn to Hunt as well as Pheasants Forever, NWTF, Delta Waterfowl, Fur Takers of America. We have a whole plethora of different partners and sponsors for this event. But the big kind of key takeaway from this event is we're trying to build that social component and connect new hunters with existing hunters. And so we're going to be giving away dozens of different mentored hunting opportunities at this event. So if you're looking to get involved in a mentored hunt, whether it's, we're going to have upland, we have deer hunts, we have waterfowl hunts, we have squirrel and rabbit, and we even have some fur bear and raccoon hunting. So there will be a little bit for everything. And if you're a seasoned hunter and you're not necessarily looking for mentored hunts, we have a bunch of different gear that we're going to be giving away. We have Vortex Optics as a big sponsor, Hunt Stand, Onyx Maps, a bunch of call companies. So it's going to be a really fun event to kind of get out, hang out with some people, win some prizes, and meet like-minded folks. But with that, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us on any of our social media channels. on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. We're happy to help. And we will send a recording of this webinar to everybody who registered. So if you had to leave early, you'll get a copy of it, or if you want to refer back to it, we'll throw it up on YouTube quickly and get that sent out to you. So apologize for running a little bit late today. Got kind of long-winded in some cases, but I thank you for joining us, and I appreciate you being here, and hopefully we'll see you in the woods sometime soon. Thank you.